Welcome everybody to this my tutorial. Today we're going to be having a look at animation again. What we're going to be making is just a bouncing ball using a principle of animation called squash and stretch, also using a tool in Maya called the graph editor. Okay, so first of all, to make an animation of a bouncing ball, I want to make a ball. And I also want to make a plane for the ball to bounce on, so I've got that nice, so I can see clearly what the ball's bouncing on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move, see how the pivot point of this object is in the center. I actually want that at the base of it, the bottom of the ball, just so I can make the contact with this object and the surface much more clean. So I'm just going to tap spacebar to go into an orthographic view, press D. Oh, actually I might go into that view, press D to move my center point, and I can just move that down to the base just there, and then release D, and I can move this up to this thicker gray line, which will represent, which is where my, okay, cool. I'm going to apply a material, and I've already got a material from the last one, so I'll just pop that on there. And I'm also going to put a material on the plane, so I might just put, I made one earlier, but make a material please. Okay, cool. I'm just going to make a couple of balls here, and the reason I'm going to do that is just so you can see the difference between the two. So you don't need to make 3 balls, you can just make one, but just make sure that you have 3 balls. I'm going to have 3 balls just so you can see the difference between the two. So I'm going to press Command D, or Control D, sorry, I'm thinking about Macs. To duplicate, Control D. Cool. And so I'm going to make this animation to all 3 of my objects. Okay, cool. So my first object, actually I can probably do this all 3. I'm going to move to frame 1. And we want to have a bouncing ball animation that goes for a few seconds and it's going to loop. So it's going to bounce and land in the same spot. And on frame, so when I get to the end, it's going to be at the same position. So we want to make sure that we have the same settings on frame 1 as we do on the last frame. Remember earlier that when we went into the previous animation, we went to our frame rate, which is the amount of frames per second. This is 24 frames per second, and a rough calculation. It means I've got approximately 4 seconds for every 100 frames. So it's actually 96 frames, but it doesn't really matter. So 100 frames is about 4 seconds, which I think is fairly good for a animation. But I might make it 5 seconds. So I'll make it 6 seconds. So I'll make it 150. So these 2 boxes are going to be 150, and these 2 are going to be 1. So remember, 24 seconds is 1 frame, so 1 second, sorry. 3, 4, 5, 6 seconds. So I think that'd be about right for a bouncing ball. That can vary depending on the height and the type of ball and what have you. So on frame 1, I'm going to go to frame 1 and press S to set a key. Make sure you don't have your focus in a box, and press S. I'm going to choose that one, press S, and choose that one, press S. So I've got to set 3 keyframes. You only have to do 1, but remember, I'm going to do the same thing at the last frame. So I've got 3 animations, but all of the positions are exactly the same, so it's not going to do anything. And I want to choose right in the middle. I'm going to move all my objects up, press S, S, and S. So when I play this, we have our 3 balls. I'm not going to say bouncing because really they're just moving up and down. They're not interacting with, they're not actually interacting with the surface at all. They're just simply oscillating, floating through space. Okay, so let's have a look at that motion. Okay, good. So I'm going to open up a thing called the graph editor. So I've got my 3 spheres. I'm going to go to Window, General Editor, Animation Editors, and Graph Editor. Now, if your graph editor doesn't look like this, there is a problem with the new graph editor. So what you need to do, very quickly side note, that's if yours doesn't look like this, go to Animation Settings, choose Animation under Settings on the left here, and make sure that you have your graph editor UI as classic. See that? So Settings, Animation, Classic. Rewind this YouTube video if you missed what I said, because that's very important, or unless yours isn't working properly. Sometimes Maya can be unpredictable at times. Okay, so Windows, Animation Editors, and Graph Editor. And you can see here we have all of our attributes. So we have Translate, which means move, Rotate, which is rotate, and Scale, which is scale. And we have all of these lines. We've got flat lines, and we've got a curved line, and we've got this red line. So I'm going to explain what all of these things are. The most important thing is our ball is moving up and down. So that means it's moving up and down on the y-axis. So move y-axis is translate y. That is our animation that is curved. Our ball doesn't move left or right. It doesn't rotate. So all of these objects, all of these other ones are going to look flat. The translate y is the one we'll look at because our ball is bouncing up and down. Very simple. Okay, good. All right. Now, as we move along our timeline, you can see this red slider on our graph editor moving along. That's because this graph editor represents 2 things. Time, so frames. So we've got 150 frames. So when we get to 75, it's at the top. When we get to 150, it's at the end. So this graph represents, in this case, the y value, and it also represents time. Okay, cool. Now you can see that this graph is curved, and it's a little bit funny because it just means that our animation is speeding up and slowing down. If you think about that in terms of a curve, and if you can't think of that, if you can't visualize that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of these, choose tangents, and choose linear. And now we can look at this one. This one has a linear graph. It goes up and down, straight up and down, and it's got there's no curve there. It's just a straight line. So it's going to be a constant motion. Now let's have a look at that. I'm going to look at these 2 animations together, side by side, and we'll see what the difference is. I'm going to press play. Now you can see that these 2 on the right are sort of speeding up and curving down. This one's got a very jerky movement. I'm just going to click over it. This one's got a very jerky movement, and these 2 have got smooth movements. All right. And that's because this one changes direction very suddenly, whereas these 2 ease in and ease out. So that means that let's have a look at the graph editor again. Animation editors and graph editor. And you can see the translate here. It eases slow. It doesn't just jump up. It slowly goes up and then slowly goes down. So it has this nice easing effect. Let's play that again. So these 2 ease, whereas this one is jerky. And so what I'm going to do with this middle one is I'm going to change its attributes. So I'm going to go to Windows, Animation Editors, and Graph Editor. I'm just going to change this start and end one to be tangents linear. So what's going to happen here is it's going to, from the ground, it's going to suddenly change direction. It's going to go It's going to ease to a top and then suddenly change direction. So let's have a look at that. Press play. Now, the motion of the other two is probably a little bit distracting. But what you can see here is this one's actually acting a little bit more like a ball would if it was bouncing, because it slows when it reaches the peak. So as it reaches its peak, it slows down. But when it hits the ground, it has a sudden bounce. It has a sudden boing. So this is actually probably a more realistic movement than the other two. And we can really accentuate that. So what I'm going to do is go to Windows, Animation Editors and Graph Editor. I'm going to make this one here, make these sort of tangents a little bit wider. Oops. If it lets me. Oh, it's making a lot out of me. Actually, what I can do is select this bottom tangent and make it a little bit. Make this a little bit bouncier, which will have the exact same effect. So I'm going to make this. So you can see here it's going to accelerate more rapidly and then slow down and then start to accelerate again. So it's going to go down, up fast, slow down, then speed up again. So much more like a bouncing ball. Okay, so and just for comparison, I've got a little bit of a drawing here. So there's a little bit of a drawing here showing this exact same thing. We have the ball and representing the frames of the ball, and this ball, each frame, these frames are closer together, so it means it's slow, and then it gets faster as it decelerates. So this is the effect we're going for this easing in and easing out. So it's easing out of motion and it's easing into motion. Okay, let's play that. Yeah, we might have even done that a little bit too much, but still, it's a much more realistic looking bounce than the other two. Cool. All right, so the next thing we're going to add to this is a property called, a thing called squash and stretch. Let's have a look at that. So what squash and stretch is, and we look back at the image here, is that as the ball hits the ground, it's going to squash, and as it accelerates, it's going to stretch out. So this is a thing. This is something that we use in animation called squash and stretch, and it helps show a bouncy movement. So for example, if somebody's going to playing basketball, they're going to do a dunk, for example, they're going to jump. What they're going to do is they're going to go duck down first before they spring upwards. Or any kind of sport where people are doing a jumping motion, they're going to have this sort of squash and stretch motion. And so it applies to a lot of things and not just bouncing balls. So let's have a go at that. So what I'm going to do here is on frame, I'm going to copy my frame on frame 1. Copy. I'm going to move that to frame and paste that on frame 3. And the same thing I'm going to do here. I'm going to paste that on frame, a few frames back here. And on my first frame, I want to have my ball, so I'm going to have a couple of frames with no movement. And on my first frame, I'm going to squash down my object. Then I'm going to copy that and paste that in my last frame. So I'm have the exact same position. Oops, I didn't press S. That was silly. Let's try that again with pressing S. I'm going to squash it down, press S, copy, go to the last frame, and paste. Let's play that again. Oh, might have had that a little bit too fast. So what we can do is move some frames around. So I'm going to cut that frame and paste it in about frame 7. And I'm going to cut this frame. So all I'm doing is just cutting and pasting frames. I'm just using this by eye. Awesome. And now what I want to do is make sure that I've got my graph editors looking correct. So let's try it again. So I'm going to go to my graph editor, Windows, Animation Editors, Graph Editor. Oh, it's done a bit of a crazy old thing here. So you can see it's made these strange tangents here. So we want to look at these individually just so we don't get mixed up. So I'm going to look at Translate Y. You can see here it's got this little bit of a bobble. So I'm going to select that one and change that to linear. I'm going to change this one also to linear. I'm going to change this one also to linear. And like I did before, I'm going to just adjust this curve a little bit. Whoops. Oops, I need to use my move tool. Not too much, because as we saw earlier, if you go too much, it can get a bit out of control. And I can see here that I've got this little bit of a, just zoom in here, there's a little bit of a wiggle here, so I want to change that one to, it's linear. And I move this line straight up here. Whoops. And if your controls go a bit crazy like that, I'm just going to go View and Frame All. Okay, so this should be flat to indicate that it doesn't move on the y-axis. And hopefully I can move these individually. Anyway, let's have a look at that. See how it's improved or not. Much better. Bounce. Okay, so it's starting to bounce a little bit more realistically, which is good. Okay, so let's go have another look on the graph editor. Windows, Animation Editor, Graph Editor. And now we're going to have a look. Now remember, all of these are flat to represent that they have no change, except the one that is going to have change is our scale Y, which is how we are squashing our object and stretching our object. And this is actually making it pretty good. But I might even move this across a couple of frames. Move this one back a couple of frames. Okay, let's play that. And play. Much better. Okay, if we go back to the drawing that we were looking at earlier, you can see here that as it comes out of the squash, it starts to stretch a little bit, and it starts to stretch as it accelerates. So this is just another part of our squash stretch to make things accentuate in length as they accelerate. So let's have a look at that. So what I want to do here is I want to have my object start to stretch outwards a little bit higher. So what I'm going to do is use my scale. I'm going to scale it smaller, but I'm also going to scale it taller, so it's skinnier. And S, and then I'm going to copy this keyframe. And I'm going to paste it about here. Okay, now that's stuffed up our movement a little bit. We only wanted that to affect our scale and not our movement. So let's get rid of that on our scale, on our graph editor. So Windows, Animation Editor, there's a graph editor. And you can see here, we've got these two sort of little, that's what our little jiggle is. I'm going to just delete that. I'm going to delete that. So back to our nice translate Y movement. And all we're affecting here is the scale. So it's going bigger than smaller. So it's going to stretch out. Should be good. And we should also have a little bit of a scale X and a scale Y. Scale X and scale Z. Yeah, which should also follow that same curvature. So let's have a look at that. Press play. I probably want to have that arch come in a little bit earlier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut that. And remember, this keyframe only affects our scale now. So I might put that there. And I'm also going to cut it here. And I'm also going to paste it here. Cool. All right, so we can tweak those around a bit, but this one has a much more animated looking bounce, so it's got much more cartoony bounce. So you don't need to do it as much as I've done with this, as much squash and stretch, but as you can see, it certainly adds to the character of the ball, and it certainly adds to the, it makes it look more interesting than the other two. All right, so what I want you to do is make this middle ball. I've only got these other two here for a comparison. So make this ball animation like this. And what I want you to do is save that scene and send me a photo of it, or actually it'll be hard for you to send that in. I'll work out a way for you to hand that in, and which I'll post on the class discussion. And that concludes this tutorial. Thank you very much.